Tim, and hello everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to present to you today on a topic that I'm particularly passionate about on account of my background as being a software engineer as well as an electronics engineer. My personal opinion is that IEC 6304 and its principles are not really well understood and well appreciated by a lot of the development community. And so what I'm hoping to do today is to give some insights into how to go about really tackling it and doing justice to compliance with its requirements. So just to touch and recap on what an active medical device is, here are a few examples of projects that Genesys has been involved with, and all of these devices contain electronics and microcontrollers that host software. And hence,
can I just interrupt for a moment? There's had a couple of people saying that you're quite low. Your sound volume's quite low.
Okay, is that better? I'll talk more loudly.
Talk more loudly or adjust your microphone. That'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, not a problem. I'll really make sure I speak up. So these are examples of devices that incorporate microcontrollers and software that needs to meet the requirements of IEC 6304. This is a slide that we've shown a number of times, and it's to set the context. 6304 applies in the blue triangle, so it's part of the systems development activity, which involves development of the electronics and the software, and hence comes within the scope of 6304 coverage. I will be moving through quite a few complex aspects quite quickly. We will make the slide deck available by way of a PDF on the website, so don't feel the need to try and furiously copy down any of the document references and the like that you'll be seeing, because this will be available via the website to preserve that information. So in terms of medical devices with software, the most common device that you're likely to encounter will be something with an embedded microcontroller performing a medical device function, either diagnostic or therapeutic, and that device will have a microcontroller embedded that will contain the software. But also within the frame of this are systems that will, in a typical Internet of Things type medical device, you'll have not only the device itself, but you'll have other devices that communicate with it for control, user interface, data gathering, and the software running on those devices also comes within the scope of 6304. And finally, an evolving field is what's known as software as a medical device. This is where you have software which is not associated with any dedicated electronics hardware, but would run on a traditional platform such as a PC, a cloud server, or a mobile device. And it comes within the scope of this newly evolving field, software as a medical device. And I've given a couple of references down the bottom that relate to evolution in this area.
Geoff, I imagine that software as a medical device really falls into the realm we call commonly known as digital health.
I guess digital health is one example of software of a medical device. So a digital health system, which say a database or even a customer relationship management type environment where you're dealing with customer records and so forth on a server-based system, you would typically find that the software running in that environment would be categorized as software as a medical device.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
When you look at the fundamental objective of complying with a standard like IEC 6304, I think it pays to step back and say, what is the real reason we're doing this? And I've just put a few dot points up there that really are motherhood and apple pie statements and just make common sense, but it's essentially to develop high quality, maintainable software that is bug-free, meets the functional requirements, and has low risk in terms of software failure causing any injury to patients, operators, or the environment. So it pays to keep that in mind. The objective is not to comply with the standard. The objective is to achieve the things on the dot points.
So Geoff, when you're talking about risks, we could be talking about things like a measurement that's erroneous or, leads to a false diagnosis, or something like that? Is that what you're talking about?
Well, that's one category. So failure of the device to be efficacious in performing its diagnostic or therapeutic ability. But of course, you do have instances where software failure can cause physical injury. For example, if you're driving a motorized mechanism that could entrap someone or cause damage, or more extremes, take an example of an X-ray machine where if the software goes haywire and you overdose the patient, you could in fact kill them. So it's not only the function in terms of therapy or the diagnosis, but also physical safety. So the answer is all of the above. Anything that could possibly cause risk to the patient, but also not forgetting the operators. Environmental damage is probably less of a concern in the software domain, but certainly there are instances where the operator could cause some harm by a device, particularly a mechanical controlled device. So to define software lifecycle management, and it is important that it applies throughout the life cycle of the software from the very get-go when you're conceptualizing what the software is and does, through the development process, verification of the software, validation of the product or system that incorporates the software, and also the maintenance phase where you're addressing bugs, deficiencies, and improvements that may happen throughout the life cycle. So it is a holistic end-to-end process. And I'll touch on that a little later in addressing the issue of, can you do all this stuff retrospectively? To which the answer is a resounding no. So there are a couple of standards involved, and the focus today is IEC 62304, which is the specific software lifecycle process for medical devices. But IEC 60601-1 actually has relevance in that it calls up 62304 and also addresses topics outside of the scope of 62304. You'll notice today's presentation is an extremely acronym-rich environment, and I've tried to identify the key acronyms that you'll come across and explain what they are and where they're derived from. So today's focus is 62304, but I will be explaining how that fits within the context of 60601-1 and indeed other compliance standards and regulatory regimes. Just looking at a couple of perspectives on this and why does this matter and who does it matter to? From a chief technology officer or a lead engineer or a software engineer's perspective, what the standard does is effectively drives the adoption of software engineering best practice. So there's no magic in the standard or anything that you will find highly divergent from best practice of software engineering, but it does formalize and regularize an approach to that within the context of medical device development. So this is linking into the objectives that I outlined before, but in more specific detail. What's the CTO interested in doing? Producing high quality, bug-free software, minimizing risks, and an important dot point at the bottom that, as will be illustrated by the process, it's not certainly not permissible, and in any cases impractical, to try and do all the regulatory compliance stuff after having completed the software development, which is a temptation often for a lean cash-starved startup to try and park some of this stuff and think about doing it later. But it's simply not possible to achieve compliance by doing that.
Geoff, can you just briefly, I'm interested that you put up the Chief Technical Officer as a perspective, because in good practice, it is good to have a CTO. To what extent should a CTO be looking to build up his own team of software and hardware engineers? And to what extent should they be looking to outsource, to people, to consultants like Genesys and others in the marketplace? And what's the pros and cons? And, where does it make sense to bring people in-house to your team, and where does it make sense to go out-house?
I mean, I obviously have a vested interest in this answer in terms of Genesys' point of view, But a genuine, honest perspective is that the complexity involved in software engineering of a complex software system to comply with IEC 62304 is a formidable task. So unless you have a chief technology officer or a lead software engineer or a lead engineer who is highly skilled in managing software engineering developments, and a team that can support those requirements in terms of the rigors of the development and the documentation that's involved, it is a substantial investment to set up such a team. So that would lead a startup or a lean development project to lean on the shoulders of a third-party organization that has the skill set and capability in terms of trying to build that in-house. So looking at other perspectives from a CEO's point of view, there is a mandatory requirement for compliance with IEC 62304 in terms of medical regulatory device certification requirements and regulatory standards. So the CEO, if they want their device to be legally saleable, will therefore want the CTO to ensure that the software complies with their regulatory standards. And of course, the regulators have finger in the pie, and I've got another slide coming shortly that summarizes where that sits. In terms of quality management, as I'll highlight, ISO 13485 doesn't specifically call up any technical standards. It is more generic than that, but it does require the development to comply with the applicable regulatory standards. That's where 62304 comes into the frame.
Geoff, I'm just conscious of time because I know that you've got a lot of slides on the detail later on. So I'm suggesting that we probably move through these ones fairly quickly.
Sure. So I will motor on here, and bear in mind you'll have this slide deck available to you. So this slide just to summarise where 135 fits in, and also the medical device single audit program, which is a multinational arrangement whereby you can have your quality system and your product audited by one process that covers multiple jurisdictions. Once again, it doesn't call up 62304 specifically, but it does have some emphasis on the software requirements that will be addressed. And I've got some document references there that you may find useful. So we'll scoot through some of these bits fairly quickly. So where do the regulators come in? In a nutshell, all of the major regulatory regimes internationally, and I've just listed a few of the more common ones there, recognize IEC 62304 as a way of achieving compliance with the requirements of the regulatory regime in respect of software. So I won't labour reading through the detail there, but there's a very useful reference at the bottom that has a summary of the perspective of most of the countries that you're likely to want to sell your product into. Note that the version of 62304 that's quoted there is an out-of-date one, but it's reasonable to assume that it ripples through to the current version. So in a nutshell, if you want to sell a medical device that incorporates software in any regulatory regime, you will need to comply with 62304. I've identified 60601-1 because it's the headline document for medical device safety for electrical medical devices. And it calls up 62304 within the context of a couple of conditions. If the electronic device software can impact upon basic safety, i.e. can you injure someone or the operator or the environment with the device, then it applies. Or if the essential performance, which is the performance of the clinical function, is dependent on the software, then IEC 62304 applies. So beyond the regulator's requirements, 60601-1 does call up 62304 as applicable for the vast majority of medical devices that incorporate software. This diagram is a V-model diagram. I won't talk to it in detail, but it appears in 60601-1 and also annexed to 62304. Important thing to note, the green highlighted area is the scope of 62304, but there are also software obligations that reside at the higher levels as called up by 60601-1. I won't go through the detail of this diagram, but it's well worth having a look at that to get the context of where 62304 fits into the scheme of things. So moving on to 62304 and moving through quite rapidly, it primarily addresses the items shown against the arrows there, and I'll be talking to each of those just in overview. And bear in mind there are several different graduations of the class of software to which the standard applies. Class A, if the software can't contribute to any hazards to the patient or operator. The vast majority of devices you'll find will fall into Class B, where there is a risk of non-serious injury to the patient. That includes failure to deliver the therapeutic benefit or failure to perform a diagnostic function. Their class typically is non-serious injury, or at the extreme could be serious injury. And also from my point of view, in relation to Class A, I'd be tempted to say, why bother? It really doesn't give you a huge benefit in achieving the overall objective in relation to the quality and bug-free software objectives. So within that context, at Genesys, we apply effectively IEC 6304 Class C to all software we develop, including non-medical software. And I'll point to that as we go through the presentation in terms of the alignment with software engineering best practice. Just one important point, in determining the class of software, you should assume that any software fault that could possibly occur that could cause damage or injury, no matter how remote you think the possibility might be, you should set the probability of that fault occurrence to 100% on the basis of if it can happen, it will happen. So it's not appropriate to determine that software is Class B, or sorry, perhaps Class A rather than Class B on the basis that you think the probability of the software fault is remote, because the standard does require you to ascribe 100% probability to the fact that the software failure can occur.
Geoff, I have a question here, if you could just go back, from Kim asking, how can you confirm if you're a Class A? What is the process by which you work out what class your device is from a software perspective?
Well, in relation to the software, if you hold the reset button held and the software doesn't run, can that cause an injury or a negative outcome for the patient?
Yeah.
At the extreme. So the device cannot be at all reliant upon the software for its function or its therapeutic benefit.
Yes, I understand that. I'm just wondering, is that something that TGA assesses in the course of the regulatory process?
It's normally down to the manufacturer to make that determination, but the TGA certainly will probably not give you guidance, but if you get it wrong, they'll certainly let you know. Regulators, unfortunately, are in this domain that they won't advise you what to do, but they'll let you know if you've done the
Yeah,
right
and interestingly, it came up in one of the members meeting last week, where one of the suggestions was that the TGA doesn't really give very much guidance at all, but the FDA does. They'll actually assign you a case officer and do a preliminary assessment and to give you some early guidance on what you need to look at. So,
and by way of guidance, it's just a rough guide. Class A software would align roughly with a Class 1 medical device typically, but it's quite fuzzy at the edges. And so I'd encourage everyone to, if they're going to comply with 62304, to comply with Class B because of the benefits it brings to the quality of the software and the reliability and reputation of the product.
Yeah.
This slide just reproduces a table from 6304 that identifies the differences between the classes, and it doesn't actually list the topics, so you need to go through the standard to determine the topics have covered. But what I'd like to do is emphasize the fact, curiously, the items that are excluded from Class B that are included in Class C are, in fact, in my view, extremely important parts of high quality software engineering. So I'm a little bit bemused as to why the Class C emissions in relation to detailed software design specifications and the like are not included in Class B, but that's the way the standard is. But I encourage everyone to really seriously consider voluntarily adopting the Class C principles, if not within the formal compliance scope, but certainly as an objective in the development. But Tim, I'm probably going to go over the half hour here, but I'll aim at 40 minutes, and that will leave some time for questions. And if we don't get any questions, I may loop back and cover a couple of topics in the latter slides that we probably won't have time to get to. This is another reproduction from 6304, and it's quite a good diagram in terms of showing how the standard aligns with the activities that you will be undertaking during software development. This is not intended to prescribe your software development methodology or your software project plan, but nevertheless, it is a useful scaffold on which to hang your software development process that aligns with the numbered sections of the standard as indicated down the lines 5.1 through to 5.8, and with the overriding software configuration management covering the whole process, software problem resolution, which mainly applies after the software has been released, that is also applicable during the development, and of course risk management, which is all invasive from the start to the finish.
Geoff,
I'll touch on each of these process steps in the following.
I've got another question here from Gary, which I think might relate to the previous slide. In regards to the software, and I think he's talking about the risk here, what if the software relates to a non-essential feature like an LCD as opposed to a functional thing like measuring the heart rate?
Well, the question you've got to ask is if the driver for the LCD fails, what does that mean? Or if the driver from the LCD gives misleading results, for example, if you're looking at heart rate and the display freezes or stutters, what is the outcome for the patient? So therefore, things that you think might be very benign are in fact potentially quite critical in terms of the device performing its function and therefore not presenting a risk to the patient. I guess you'll get the general theme here, and this is my personal view, tend towards applying at least Class B to virtually any development you'll do to make sure that you don't end up skimping and falling back on Class A and finding yourself in strife when you're going through certification. No one ever gets caned for over-complying. So running through some of the key aspects, software development planning is a critical part of the process, and you are required to produce a formal software design and development plan which guides the process. The software development plan must link into the overall system design and development plan and be referenced by it and also referenced back into it. There are a couple of other documents that I've suggested are useful that we produce at Genesys. One is a 6304 compliance plan, which demonstrates how are we going to comply with 6304 in terms of the documentary artifacts we generate. And we produce a report that is a checklist to say, yes, we've done all those things. So when you're having your product going through certification assessment, you can actually demonstrate that you have complied with the process, and you can identify as a ready reference into all the documents that demonstrate that you've achieved compliance with the various clauses of 6304. So at the beginning, software requirements analysis follows on from the system requirements analysis. So during the system requirements analysis to define the product, you should be producing design input specification and user needs specification. And these need to be traceable down through to the software requirements specification. As a word of warning, try and avoid burdening your software requirements spec with items that are in fact system requirements, for example, usability or user interface requirements. Try and limit the software to specifically what the software needs to do to support those system level requirements. Otherwise, you'll end up with a lot of requirements in your software requirements that impose a large software verification burden that really should be shouldered at the system verification or product verification levels. Important point, there is a requirement for 62304 to actually analyze your software requirement specification to demonstrate that the requirements are self-consistent, complete, traceable to the requirements at the system level, and also verifiable. So you should have, as part of your verification process, verification of the actual specification for soundness. This often gets overlooked. We can jump back to some of the slides later if you want to go through some of the detail if we have time. Sorry, Tim?
So I think just a reminder to keep your voice up. You're fading a little bit.
Yeah, actually this new headset of mine is letting me down a little bit. So software architectural design is called up by 60601-1 and also by 62304. Specifically require the architecture of the software system to be formally documented to show how the software elements interact with one another and how the software interacts with the hardware. It should be fairly straightforward to develop a coherent software architectural design if your hardware architecture is sound. There should be a fairly close mapping for an embedded system between the software architecture and the hardware architecture. For software as a medical device, of course, that doesn't apply, but once again, there should be a sound software architecture. And this should include partitioning between input-output drivers, for example, and application software. Also, we need to consider software units, where a software unit is an indivisible element of software, but in practical terms, that means software that has a defined application programming interface and can sensibly be tested standalone. 62304 does require you to test software units in isolation from the software system. So you simply can't have the entire microcontroller suite as one monolithic unit tested at the functional level. You are obliged to test each of those software units down to quite a granular level at their own functional interface level. It's left to the manufacturer to determine the granularity of software. So that the temptation might be to say, oh, well, my whole software suite is one software unit. But I think anyone doing a regulatory compliance assessment would take a fairly dim view of that. So it is important to really divide the software down to quite a significant number of testable software units. We'll talk about soup a little later.
I'd just like to ask my first MedTech for Dummies question for the day on behalf of those who might not be familiar with things like software architecture. So can you just explain what a software architecture might typically look like? What are the elements that would make it up? And to what extent, and how does that relate to the software units? Is the architecture made up of every single piece of software unit, or are we talking about blocks of similar software units? Can you just give me a sense and throw some names out there of some key elements? Like you mentioned a microcontrol unit. What are the other kind of elements that might make up an architecture?
To put this in context, I use the example of a system that uses an operating system, for example, RTOS, real-time operating system. And then under RTOS, you may have some functional processes that control the device's function to the user. You will have input-output drivers that interface with UARTs and I2C buses and other software peripherals, memory storage devices. Then you may have what is typically classed as middleware, which is software applications that might perform algorithmic processing or run a communications interface. Each of these items would appear as blocks on the software architectural diagram, and they would be structured in layers with the input-output drivers that interface with the hardware at the bottom. Then you have middleware, as the name suggests, in the middle, and that would consist of algorithms and processing routines that perform utility functions. Then at the top, you would have the applications that would control, for example, the user interface, an LCD screen, or would control some actuators, some motors, or some valves, or some control indicator lights, for example. And this would all be within the context of the operating system that manages the operation of it all. That should all be shown diagrammatically on an architecture diagram.
Sure. And so where do these software units fit within these blocks in the block diagram?
You'll find most of the blocks will contain one or more software units. So there's not a one-to-one correspondence, but a good starting point. Every block on your architectural diagram is a potential candidate to be a software unit.
Okay. I'll let you go on, Kim. I'm just acknowledging your question. I might ask that at the end because it's quite a broad question, and I'll get to that at the end.
Okay, so into the detailed design domain, and interestingly, for other than Class C, there's not a lot of impost posed in 6304, but when you start to look at the requirements of the FDA, for example, they are much more prescriptive in terms of having a software design specification. So I would strongly urge compliance with, at least in principle, if not in full detail, with the requirements to document your software design at the detailed level. What I mean by this is where you have these mythical software units that are doing stuff, to define for each unit what its functional requirements are, and also document its test cases so we can verify the software units coherently. By doing this, you'll then be satisfying requirements of the FDA, which do go beyond those of 6304 in this respect.
Geoff, can you give me an example of what a test case might look like?
Well, say, for example, you have a requirement to flash an LED. Sounds really simple, but what's flashing mean? How long is the LED on for? How long is it off for? What is the flashing rate? How quickly does the LED turn on and off?
What color is
What
it?
brightness is the LED? So all of these things can be influenced by software. So the test cases would be step by step saying, can I achieve a certain flash rate? Can I achieve a certain on duration and off duration? If I've got a multicolor LED, can I achieve the different color levels at various brightnesses? And just a step-by-step process to test that the software control can achieve each of those things.
And when does the testing actually occur?
A number of points. The formal verification testing occurs for the units when the unit has effectively been developed and provided by the design engineer to the person doing the testing. But of course, the design engineer will also run those tests before that to make sure that the software works. Those tests will be repeated, at least in part, during system integration testing and system verification testing at the system level. And indeed, if you make changes to the software once it's been released, you may repeat those tests during regression testing. So the same tests may be repeated quite a number of times. That's an indicator for having a well-defined and documented test procedure and having test software to facilitate that process, particularly during regression testing. So you're not laboriously repeating a whole heap of manual tests time and time again.
Okay, thank you.
So software unit implementation verification is pretty much what it says. You are actually writing the software, doing the coding and the associated documentation for each of those software units, and then verifying their performance. And they need to be verified against defined acceptance criteria. Those criteria must have pass-fail parameters so you can say definitively whether the software meets the requirement or not. It's important also to, before doing testing against test criteria, and this applies for any of the verification, not only at the unit level, but the system level, to make sure that the test criteria and acceptance criteria have been independently signed off. So one software engineer should write the test criteria, then an independent person, preferably a senior software engineer, should go through and say, yes, those test criteria and tests do satisfactorily demonstrate that the software meets its requirement. So software integration testing occurs at the next level, and this is when we have our software units all tested and proven, and we have our operating system in place. We would normally, for an embedded system, have our hardware platform with the operating system to run on it. We go through a process of integrating all of those software elements together into a functioning system. Now, in the case of an embedded microcontroller domain, this tends to occur as a progressive process. For example, you can't really test the hardware unless the software support's in place. So it is a progressive and iterative process of integration. And your software integration plan, which you are obliged to produce under 6304, should recognize this. So it's not a case of you get to a certain point and all of a sudden you start your software integration and testing. It necessarily needs to be done progressively, particularly in an embedded microcontroller environment. In terms of the verification that the overall integration has been successful and that the software functions, it is permissible to do this as a part of system level verification. So in cases where the system simply won't work unless the integration's been done, it doesn't really make sense to test the integration aspects independently, you can verify software integration as a part of system level verification for that software. So software system testing or system level verification, this is rather different from unit testing. Unit testing, you're testing the units against the detailed unit test specification. But at the software system level, you are verifying the software against the software requirement specification and ultimately the system requirement specification. And the two tend to be interlinked. So this is a step-by-step process, clause by clause, against the software requirement specification and the system requirement specification to make sure that all of these software dependent aspects function satisfactorily. Once again, you need to have documented pass-fail criteria, clause by clause, and those criteria and the tests need to be signed off and reviewed before you implement the tests. It's important to do that before, not after, or your quality system auditor will cause you substantial grief. And during the process, if bugs are found, there is a requirement to go through a formal process of rectifying those bugs and retesting any aspect that could be affected by the software fix. That includes not only proving that the bug has been fixed, but making sure that there are no side effects. And all of these tests must be formally recorded.
Geoff, how can you prove that there aren't any side effects when those side effects may be unknown? You don't realize what the impact might be until it's way too late.
That really comes down to engineering judgment, and it's not practical to say retest everything after you fix every bug. So it's really a judgment process for senior software engineer wearing his risk management hat to make sure that risks are maintained, makes a sensible engineering judgment on what level of retest needs to be performed. Now, ideally, once the whole process is complete and all of the bugs have been fixed, some repetition of the overall system verification should be repeated by way of a regression test, just to give a high level of confidence. But I mean, it's not practical to say retest everything after every bug fix or you'd be there forever.
I can imagine that, inexperienced software developers that don't have a really rigorous system and team in place, when they do make changes, it can actually lead to a cascade and things really get out of control. What are the techniques that you would typically use to make sure that you have enough rigor in the process so that this problem never arises?
This is really where your system architecture and your dissection of the system into units and your unit verification comes into play, because a well-designed architecture provides a maximum level of segregation and independence between the levels. And to give a really detailed example, you should constrain control of interrupts and interrupt priorities only to the very lowest level of input-output drivers. If you have people, developers enabling and disabling interrupts or setting interrupt priorities in the application layer, you're just asking for problem of causing side effects and interactions. So really good example of bulletproofing the software by good functional partitioning and making sure that you don't allow potentially bug-prone software functions to occur willy-nilly throughout the whole software. Another really good example is make sure you toggle your watchdog only in one place in the code. Don't have an endless while loop sitting somewhere toggling the watchdog, or the software can happily sit there forever doing nothing, keeping its watchdog alive. So really does come down to a sound architectural design.
Okay, I'll let you move on. I've got a few questions here I want to get to, so I'll let you finish.
Okay, so risk management is all important and all pervasive. I won't go into it in a great deal of depth here, but just to note that it is one of the major aspects of your software development process will be risk management. You should think in terms of probably allocating something of perhaps the order between 1/4 and 1/2 of your software development budget to software risk management. Now that sounds excessive, but it's a realistic expectation, and it's often overlooked and underplayed. The software risk management aspect is an extremely onerous part of the process, and just a list of documents that I've indicated there probably give you some insights into the size and scope of this task. Just to note, there is that technical guideline to ISO 14971 is well worth examining in detail, and it does identify a whole raft of what are called common cause software hazards. And these are things like arithmetic errors and memory overflows and stack overflows and a whole raft of things that are not specific to the application, but are just general software design aspects that need to have attention paid to them, because they are a typical source of a substantial source of bugs in typical software development projects that aren't well managed. And finally, you will find quite often that your software is called upon to mitigate risks in other part of the system. So for example, if you have hardware that could cause injury or damage, you may have interlocks controlled by software that mitigate the hardware risk. Those parts of the software are called in play for special attention in doing the software risk management. And that's another fairly substantial burden that typically arises. Software release consists of putting the software into the field. I would advocate having a formal software release report where you identify and tabulate all of the software. Every module, every software unit should be identified, and the checksum of that software file should be identified, as well as the software release, the revision number and the release date of that software. The objective is so that you can then rebuild the software at a later date from the source code in a coherent manner. And it's particularly important for any build settings for compilers and linkers, for example, and the integrated development environment all be recorded so that you can replicate the software. My rule of thumb for this is to give the software release report and a thumb drive to a software engineer locked in a room with a computer and nothing else, and they must be able to rebuild the software suite, rebuild the executable. Configuration management is part of that, making sure that you know exactly what your software build state is. And during development, you'd typically be wanting to use some form of computerized system. Subversion is a good example, but there are many others that keep control of your software in a team-based environment to make sure that you're always using the latest and greatest build of all the different source code modules from all of the participants in the software development. And this needs to be formally documented in a software configuration control procedure and plan, and that's called up once again by 6304. So you'll have seen throughout this presentation in the documents you should produce, there are quite a lot of documents. You find the order of 20 or 25, 30 documents that you need to produce to comply with 6304. And some of these are substantial. For example, the software design specification, typically for even a moderately complex embedded microcontroller, could run to 300 to 500 pages of documentation of the software. So, and some of the other documents are also quite substantial. Problem resolution is applied throughout the development process, but comes into its own once the software has been released, 6304 calls up the requirement for a formal software maintenance plan that covers the software resolution process. And I'll just flick to the next slide. So this is actually another extract from 6304, and it does mirror the software development process. So whenever you're doing software maintenance, you have to cycle the software through all of these steps to make sure that any modification that you're undertaking meets the requirement. If you're doing a major software revision for new features, you will get to a point where it's actually less work to treat that as a new project under 6304 than it is to try and treat it as software maintenance. You might as well treat it as a new project because the things you need to do are pretty much the same. Let's flick back to that slide. And so in doing any software changes, you need to do formal risk assessment. So root cause analysis, particularly if you've got bugs, and then formal risk assessment to make sure that the bug is not causing undue risk to the patient and that the fix to the bug does not cause new risks. Software validation is outside the scope of 6304, but is addressed by 60601-1. For most software systems, the validation of the software goes hand in hand with the validation of the product. Taking up a lot of time here, but just to touch on SOUP, software of unknown provenance. This is potentially a major minefield, and it covers any software that hasn't been developed under 6304 and that doesn't have an adequate design and development history to comply with 6304. So, you know, any software that is in the legacy development environment, and when you look at software such as Windows operating systems, any open source software, Linux, RTOS, etc., are all classes of software of unknown provenance and come into play for special attention in the specification, verification, and risk management activities.
Sure.
To my mind, it's dangerous territory to start incorporating large amounts of SOUP into your product design because of the unknowns that you will face when you under the scrutiny of the person doing the regulatory certification process. So best avoided wherever possible. And in particular, if you're thinking about using Arduinos and Raspberry Pis and manufacturers supplied development kits that may come with functional software and input-output drivers, all of that is classed as SOUP. So be very careful when considering
Geoff,
down those development paths.
One question here from REM who said, many microcontrollers come with vast libraries that are complex. Does this mean I need to write my own so that I can say I know how they work? Have you answered his question there, or is anyone?
The ideal answer is yes, and to give you insights into that, at Genesys, we don't use any third-party libraries within the function critical space in an RTOS or a bare metal environment. We do use third-party RTOS, and if we were to do a class 2B or a class C device, we would be using Safe RTOS, which is a certified 6304 compliant platform. Unfortunately, it's hellishly expensive, but it is a route that you can follow. In terms of the drivers and libraries that come with development kits, for example, we would use all of our own drivers as much as anything, because most of the drivers you get are pretty garbagey. So we use our own drivers, and even to the point where you have hardware abstraction layers, we'll either write our own hardware abstraction layer, or we will review the hardware extraction layer of the vendor and bring it under 6304 by a review and analysis process. It does become particularly problematic in Windows and Linux environments where you really can't avoid using the SOUP, but you then need to be particularly careful to make sure that you have added protections to make sure that operating system level failures don't cause the whole software system to fail and cause grief. And I won't pretend to have a magic bullet answer to this. It is difficult and problematic.
So, Geoff,
so Chicken's approach is to avoid it if possible.
So we've got 5 minutes to go. Are you able to breeze through the last few slides? And
You just mentioned legacy software. 6304 does allow you to deal with legacy software, but it's not an escape hatch. You can't develop software under not considering 6304 and then say, oh, it's legacy software. It only applies to products that are legally on the market that predate 6304 obligations that you then want to bring up to compliant level. So it's not an escape hatch to avoid 6304 compliance. In my view, the work to get legacy software to comply is probably more than the work of redeveloping it from scratch, but personal view. And finally, just a few touch points, which I won't labour on, but we can flip back to. And particularly to note the last arrow dealing with Agile. Question often gets asked, can I do medical device software under the Agile methodology? My answer to that is to refer to all of the obligations for software design, development, planning, specification, and documentation that are called up by 6304. Make your own judgment. Incidentally, there is an ANSI guide to how to apply Agile development to medical device software development for anyone who's interested to follow that up. Second to last slide kind of answers the question that Tim posed right at the beginning. What can I do if I need help? And without that, I'll hand back to Tim to field any questions.
Okay, thanks, Geoff. And I appreciate that we've left that question time pretty short, but I think it was worth it because there was just so much content there that we had to get through. I do have a couple of questions. If people want to add any more in the short time that we have, please do type it in the Q&A box right now. And I'm going to go to a question from Kim. It's quite a long question, so I'll read it out loud for the audience. Geoff, we are a vendor-neutral data integration platform for enabling data in any format to be securely shared between trusted stakeholders. We do not ever touch the patient, and we are not involved with any data analytics or in any decisions or diagnostics. We simply provide a safe sandbox where participants can bring their favourite toys to play together securely in real time. To my mind, that is class A, if, in brackets, if a software as device at all. What do you think? Don't worry, I won't hold you to it.
Yeah, that's quite a loaded question, and it touches on the point I made about using operating systems such as Windows and the like. An approach you can take is to ensure that patient harm is avoided by some key points. The first is to make sure that any data is absolutely inextricably linked to the patient to whom it pertains, so that there is no scope that the data can get mixed up from patient to patient and cause a problem. And this, of course, includes the source data and any analytical outputs. So ways to achieve that are to embed the patient identification information with the data and then apply robust CRC, cyclic redundancy checksum protection over the top of that, and make sure that your data object incorporates that. So that in a worst case scenario, if the data gets corrupted, you've lost the data, but you can't then misassociate the data with the patient, and you can't use corrupted data because the data will fail its CRC check. So you are then relieving your platform of that aspect of the compliance. Now, the second point is how critical is that data? If it's absolutely critical that that data is where you say it's going to be when it's needed at short notice, then I would argue your software can cause harm to the patient if that data is lost. But if, for example, that data is backed up, or if it exists elsewhere, and if there is a possible no adverse outcomes from delay in accessing the data, you can take approach, one that we use, for example, for logging important data on a device. So we would have an embedded device logging data to files stored on an SD card. Those files would be uniquely identified, time-stamped, and would have CRC protection, and they would embed the patient information in the file. So that file is a self-contained element that meets the requirement. In getting that file from A to B, you could argue that if that process fails, all you've lost is the file's not where you want it when you want it. You can retrieve that file from the SD card. So no data has been lost. So as long as the time taken to recover that data doesn't pose a risk to the patient, you can then argue that the loss of the data does not cause a risk of harm to the patient.
Okay.
Now, of course, you have the issue of the credibility of your product with your end users, and that's a whole different kettle of fish, where I'd advocate adopting Class B simply so your software is effective and reliable. But from a strict regulatory point of view, then there are avenues you can follow to argue that it would be Class A.
Okay, there was one other question here. And sorry, Kim, I'm sure that Geoff will be happy to, if you want to expand on that answer. His email address is on the screen there. Shoot him a question and I'm sure he'll answer that. The last question is, why would anyone provide source code that's their IP and needs to be protected? So I think that might have that popped up a little earlier when you're talking in one of the earlier slides. Do you understand the...
Yeah, the context of the source code is not providing the source code to necessarily to third parties in terms of the recording of it, but the need to have that source code preserved as a part of the record of the medical device, as a part of the design compendium information. So the device design file or technical design file, depending on the parlance you use. So the source code must be preserved for that purpose. And incidentally, rather than use a configuration control system such as Subversion to preserve the source code, we will always do a snapshot export, typically as a zip file of the whole source code compendium. So a password protected zip file, so effectively giving it CRC protection, and then that will be preserved as a part of the compendium